Thank you for joining us. And wow, you're right. It is kind of one-sided on this side. Everyone's sitting over here. So very good to see everyone here. We are continuing our series through the longest discourse in Mark's Gospel, the Olivet Discourse. And to help you prepare for that next week, we have your assignment here, Mark 13, 28 through 37. And, please read through that and pray through it. It helps a lot as you're trying to get the sense and the feel for the text. And again, if you did take the time this week to read through this discourse and really look at it, you might also have found that, it can be difficult to understand the feeling of this text, as sometimes Jesus is telling you, hey, wait there, be patient, don't worry, the end is not yet. And then at other times he's saying, hey, run, flee, get out of Judea, the time is upon you. And so you see kind of the feeling of the text that changes. So that's what we are wrestling with here this week. Now, I was thinking about how to start this, and there's a fairly well-known story about a great medical missionary and theologian, musician, in the early 20th century. His name was Albert Schweitzer. I'm not sure if I got his name right. And as a young man, he studied the organ in Paris under Charles Marie Wider. I'm not sure about that one either. And one day in 1899, Wider confessed to Schweitzer that he couldn't understand Bach's choral preludes. The mood of the music kept shifting unpredictably. He couldn't really tell. And Schweitzer replied, well, naturally, many things in the chorals must seem obscure because they can only be explained by the texts that go with them. Wider didn't understand that the choral preludes were designed to go with particular Lutheran hymns, and so he didn't know the text that stood behind them. Once the text behind the music are understood, the music itself becomes clear. I think we meet the same problem in Jesus' Olivet Discourse. Mark begins with something so obscure that he adds a note. He tells, let the reader understand. He knows that what he has said is going to be difficult for many of his readers to understand. We can really only make sense of what's going on if we know, as it were, the text behind the music. Put simply, we need to understand the scriptural echoes and allusions that make up a good deal of this passage. Jesus is not innovating in the language he uses in this text. He is drawing on much of the Old Testament prophecy. And these texts behind the music are why we need to remember that this discourse begins with questions about the fall of the temple. You'll remember in the beginning, his disciples point out the grandeur and the beauty of the temple. And he says, you see these stones, not one will be left upon another. And so he is talking about the destruction here of the temple. Now, up to this point, through verses 5 through 13, Jesus has warned his followers not to panic. And so he's told them things that are going to happen in the coming years. And he says, these are not the end. These are not the things that are coming upon you. He's told them to stand firm. But now the mood changes, as we alluded to. And he tells them at a given signal, they are to take to their heels and flee. They've got to get out of Judea. Something is going to happen that is going to tell them that it is time to run without looking back, to run and don't even bother about grabbing your belongings. Flee so quickly that those who even have young children are going to have a hard time keeping up. And that's the moment when a disaster is coming upon Jerusalem that will be unlike any other disaster to befall mankind. But what sign is Jesus talking about? Well, let's look a little bit closer. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down or go in to get anything out of his house, and a man in the field must not go back to get his coat. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days." So Jesus refers to the abomination of desolation, standing where it shouldn't be, as the sign that is going to initiate their flight from Judea. And the text that stands behind this is one that comes from Daniel, the prophet. And he says this: "His forces will rise up and desecrate the temple fortress. They will abolish the regular sacrifice and set up the abomination of desolation." And so we see Daniel, the prophet, forewarning Israel in his time about a difficult time that is coming upon them, a time where they're going to see a man come with great forces and establish the abomination of desolation in the temple. And when one reads Daniel's prophecies, one discovers that Daniel was talking about one of the Seleucid rulers who reigned after Alexander the Great died. Antiochus Epiphanes, who reigned from 175 to 164 BC and was known for his very harsh, cruel attempts to Hellenize the Jews. And he destroyed the temple. Antiochus and his army attacked Jerusalem twice. First in 169 BC, where they slaughtered many people and they looted the temple. But then 2 years later, in 167, he dispatched Apollonius and his army of about 22,000 soldiers to attack Jerusalem on the Sabbath. And they came in, they killed off much of the male population, and they banished the Jewish rites. They forbade circumcising their sons and required them under penalty of death to sacrifice swine to other gods in the temple. And finally, in December of 167, they created a new altar in the temple, and a sacrifice for Zeus was offered upon the temple altar. And this sacrifice is the abomination of desolation that is referred to in Daniel's prophecy. Antiochus coming into the holy place, erecting his own altar and sacrificing an unclean animal, a pig, upon that altar to a foreign god, Zeus, forbidding the worship of God according to his law. So this introduces us to a very important concept as we are trying to grapple with and interpret biblical prophecy. And some people refer to this as progressive fulfillment or dual fulfillment. But what we see is that what Daniel predicts in his prophecy happened to the letter in his time. We can look throughout history and we see Antiochus perfectly fulfills everything that Daniel wrote. And yet, his abomination of desolation, this prophecy, stretches even beyond Antiochus and what Antiochus did. And so Jesus draws on the imagery of this prophecy himself for what's going to happen in his time, describing what is going to happen in AD 70 when the Roman general Titus comes in and destroys Jerusalem and the temple yet again. And yet, it only doesn't stop there. Even the Apostle John is going to draw on imagery from both Daniel and Jesus when he writes his book, the book of Revelation, which was penned around 90 AD, after the temple was destroyed. And so we see that the biblical prophecy is layered. And you see that layer upon layer, it begins to speak to reality. Jesus, in his context, is speaking of the Roman armies that are going to invade Jerusalem. They will stop the regular sacrifices in the temple, and they will set up a desolating abomination. This will be the sign that it is time not to stay and be patient, but to get out and run. And we know from historical hindsight, as I have mentioned, that this happened in AD 70. And we can read the terrible tale of the siege of Jerusalem from the historian Josephus. People starved. They ate their own babies to stay alive. Each other for scraps of dirty food and for small-scale political gains and factional infighting. In fact, we find out that more Jews were killed by other Jews during the invasion than they were killed by Romans. The time turned cutthroat. Jesus clearly wanted his followers to get out and to run from this time. There was no place for misguided national loyalty, for staying to the bitter end of such an appalling time. And so Jesus tells them, when you see these things happen, it is time to flee. He tells them, he goes on and he says, pray it won't happen in winter, for those will be days of tribulation, the kind that hasn't been from the beginning of creation until now and never will again. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would be saved. But he cut those days short for the sake of the elect whom he chose. And so Jesus teaches his disciples to pray for mercy, that their flight from Judea might not be forced during the winter, because that would exponentially increase their hardship. He warns them that these will be times of tribulation, the intensity of which has never been seen before, nor will ever be seen again. Now we'll benefit from stepping back for a moment. The tribulation the Jews faced under Antiochus Epiphanes was horrific. You'll remember that much of their male population was eliminated. It was full of hardships that were unmatched in its times. And likewise, the destruction of the temple was after Jesus was full of hardships that were unmatched by any other in its time. But you'll see this phrase, the kind. The kind will never be. Hardship is very difficult to quantify. It's not exactly measurable. And we see something from the Apostle John that speaks again to tribulation. He's writing his book of the Revelation well after the destruction of the temple, and look at what he says as well. After this I looked, and there was a vast multitude from every nation, tribe, people, and language. You will recognize that phrase from the Great Commission to go out into all the world. It says, which no one could number, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb. Then one of the elders asked me, who are these people in white robes, and where did they come from? I said to him, sir, you know. Then he told me, these are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. It seems here that the Apostle John is drawing on similar imagery that Jesus speaks in his Olivet Discourse to describe another period, a different kind of tribulation, but another period of suffering that will accompany the end of the age. So as I've mentioned, suffering is difficult to quantify. So Jesus' point here is not likely that there's a quantifiable amount of suffering that will never happen again, but rather that the period he describes will be demarcated by the kind of suffering that will be unlike anything that has happened or will happen again. But John himself warns of another time of great suffering that's going to envelop people of every nation, tribe, and language. In other words, a period of great tribulation that is going to come at the end as the gospel attains global reach. And this is in keeping with the writings of the prophets throughout the Old Testament, that the restoration of all things comes through a period of hardship, and yet out of that hardship will come blessing. What is important to understand here, because again, as we are working through the Olivet Discourse, you are hopefully aware that there are different interpretations. And there are people who wrestle and grapple with this and come to different interpretations individually, but here is where everyone comes together. Jesus assures us that God is watching over us even when it feels like we are abandoned to the suffering that we are experiencing. God's mercy isn't withheld. He ensures that the church will survive these times. And want to look at this. You'll see in this that the people who have gone through this great tribulation, where are they? They're before the throne of God. The book of Revelation, one of the main themes in the book of Revelation is to put in perspective everything that is happening now in light of the throne of God. In other words, yes, there is great hardship that comes. There are many difficulties that are experienced here in this world. And yet, as God's people, we stand before His throne. We are His and held by Him. Salvation belongs to our God, is the victory cry of those who have gone through this period of tribulation, however you interpret that period. And then Jesus says, if anyone tells you, see, here is the Messiah, see there, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will arise and will perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. And you must watch. I have told you everything in advance. So Jesus warns that these will be times demarcated by deceivers who will run wild and lead many astray. And again, Josephus tells us of many would-be messiahs and prophets during the Roman-Jewish war that led up to the destruction of the temple. And they were offering rescue, trying to gain a following and promising signs and wonders. But they all came to nothing. And of course, as we have talked about, there are different layers in biblical prophecy. And we see this much throughout history, that there have always arisen these false prophets and false messiahs promising things that they cannot deliver upon. And Jesus warns us, steer clear of these false prophets and false messiahs. But the climax here of all of this is the destruction of the temple itself. And it employs cosmic imagery to describe the catastrophe that will follow. History tells us that in the year AD 69, and I want to see here, I think I need to go on to the next passage here. Yes. There you go. Supposed to have my text here. So what we see in Jesus' prophecy is that he employs cosmic imagery to describe what is coming. And history shows us that if you study Roman history, you'll see in AD 69, 4 emperors succeeded one another. You have Nero who rises, then Otho, and then I'm really bad at pronunciation, so we're going to go with it. Vitellius, and then Vespasian. And you guys can correct my pronunciation there. The important thing is that each of these, as they rose to power and displaced one another, brought with them war and civil war, murder and violence. And as Vespasian made his way to Rome to receive his crown, his adopted son, who he kind of appointed as a general, entered, his name was Titus, entered into Jerusalem. He burnt the temple and destroyed the city, crucifying thousands of Jews. And so Jesus here uses cosmic imagery to describe the great upheaval that is going to come as the powers of his time are shaken, which is namely Rome. Rulers and kingdoms will fold up and fall under God's judgment. But Jesus here is drawing on imagery that comes from Isaiah. So look at this. Isaiah 13:10, indeed, the stars of the sky and its constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shine. All the stars in the sky will dissolve. The sky will roll up like a scroll, and its stars will all wither as leaves wither on the vine and foliage on the fig tree. So Isaiah, saying in his time and in his context, uses this kind of cosmic imagery to describe the great upheaval of the powers that existed in his day, namely Babylon and Edom, as rulers and kingdoms folded up and fell under God's judgment. And so we see here imagery, symbols that represent the powers of the time, the rulers of the age. Once again, the Apostle John is going to draw on the same imagery. Revelation 8:10, this is where he is getting a revelation of the trumpets that are about to blow. The third angel blew his trumpet. A great star, blazing like a torch, fell from heaven. It fell on a third of the rivers and springs of water. We see it again. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them were darkened, and a third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. Employing very much the same imagery that is used in the Olivet Discourse, but not quite as bad, only a third fall. And so what we see in these prophecies is God describing how the powers of the age are going to be shaken. Political powers will be shaken, they will fold up and fall under God's judgment. Perhaps one of the reasons, you might ask, why use this kind of imagery? Perhaps one of the reasons that this kind of imagery is employed so frequently by the prophets to describe the end is because it foreshadows what will actually happen in the end. And so we remember Peter. Peter says, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief. On that day the heavens will pass away with a loud noise. The elements will burn and be dissolved, and the earth and the works on it will be disclosed. So regardless, these verses are where it becomes important to understand the layered nature of biblical prophecy. Although Jesus' predictions have been about the period of destruction that will befall the temple, they also foreshadow much more. We will see Jesus uses one of the expressions in those days, an expression that the prophets oftentimes use to describe the end of the age, when God comes and the whole world stands in judgment before him. So in one sense, this isn't a prediction when we read the Olivet Discourse of the end of the whole world. Otherwise, again, what would be the point of telling his followers to flee from Judea? But it was certainly the end of their world in their time, as everything that they know has begun to come to an end, and the kingdom of God begins to stretch over the whole world as it announces, as the church announces the coming rule and reign of God. But in another sense, this does stretch forward and point to the end. It does point to how the end will come, a period that will be demarcated by suffering and hardship. Yet out of that suffering and hardship, justice will prevail. Suffering and sorrow will be driven away when Jesus returns to make all things new. And for this reason, in one sense, Jesus when he says he will come in the clouds with great power and glory after the destruction of the temple, refers to again how his kingdom is going to stretch all over the world. And we see this as many interpreters wrestle with what is meant by him coming in the clouds. Some interpreters seem to think that he is describing how his kingdom, his rule, and his reign is going to stretch over the whole world. I think that's a plausible view. But we also know, in the end, he is going to come and reveal himself in great power, a day that we all are looking forward to, a day where the corruption of this world is going to end and the glory of God's rule is going to initiate. So I think as we consider the meaning of this discourse, what Jesus is talking about, we can understand pretty easily that in its immediate context, it applies to the Jews who are looking forward to a time of great suffering when the temple will be destroyed. But at a whole nother level, it also applies to us because we are also awaiting his return when he is going to come with great power. And so I was thinking about how to close this lesson. I thought there's probably no better place than with what the Apostle Peter wrote. It poses an important question for all of us to consider. He says, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. On that day the heavens will pass away with a loud noise. The elements will burn and be dissolved, and the earth and the works on it will be disclosed. Since all these things are to be dissolved in this way, it is clear what sort of people you should be in holy conduct and godliness. As you wait for the day of God and hasten its coming, because of that day the heavens will be dissolved with fire and the elements will melt with heat. But based on his promise, we wait for a new heavens and a new earth where righteousness dwells." The question is posed to us this way. In view of this end, knowing that Jesus is returning to put an end of all the things we see in this world, what kind of people should we be? What should occupy our minds? In their day, they were told, hey, something is coming upon you so intense you don't even want to go down and grab your possessions. Likewise, something is coming upon us that is going to destroy all things we have in this world. What are we living for? So I want to invite you as we turn now our attention to worship God. If you have a need that you need us to partner with you on, if you have something you need us to walk with you in, or if you want to begin your journey as a Christian by being baptized, I want to invite you now or after the service, come seek out me or one of the elders as we turn our hearts to worship our God and our King.